Today I'm going to be showing you Bobby Fischer's most brutal and astonishing victory of the 1960s, and maybe of his entire career. And if you're one of those people who doesn't think that Bobby Fischer in his prime was even close to Magnus Carlsen in raw chess ability, this game might just cause you to rethink your position. The year is 1963, Bobby Fischer is 20 years old, and it's round 3 of the US Championship, which he will go on to win with a perfect score, winning every single game. He's probably already the best in the world, and the reason this game is so impressive is not just because of how rapidly Fischer is able to generate a winning attack seemingly out of nowhere, but it's also because of who he's up against, and that is the great Robert Byrne, who at the time of this game is in his mid-30s and who is what we would call today a super grandmaster. Now, Fischer has already scored a spectacular victory over Robert Byrne's younger and weaker brother, Donald Byrne, some 7 years earlier in his famous Game of the Century, as it's called. But when you consider how much stronger Robert Byrne is, and the fact that he is playing white in this position, where Fischer is about to make his 12th move with the black pieces, it's almost unbelievable to think that in only 4 moves from here, Fischer will have an absolutely crushing position and Byrne will be hopelessly lost. And he will go on to resign in another 6 moves after that. And it's not because he makes some obvious blunder. No, he plays pretty well. For a human, it's just that Fischer's moves are from another planet, as you're going to see. So this is a truly remarkable game. It ended up winning a well-deserved Brilliancy prize. It's an immortal masterpiece if I've ever seen one, and it all started with a King's Indian defense from Bobby Fischer with the black pieces. No surprises there. We have the G3 Fianchetto variation played by Byrne, opting for kingside development conducive to castling, as opposed to the main line knight to c3, looking for that big pawn center. c6 from Fischer is preparing d5 so that after bishop to g2, d5, c takes d5 from Byrne, the d pawn can be replaced with a pawn, keeping that e4 square on lockdown. Knight c3 now from Byrne, playing the most flexible knight move first. c3 is definitely the best square for this knight on the queen side, but he may want to put this other knight on f3 or on e2, where it's not blocking the activity of his light squared bishop, depending of course on how Fischer plays. Next is the very predictable bishop to g7, e3 now from Byrne, still keeping his intentions for this knight a mystery, but it doesn't really affect Fischer's play at all. His moves are pretty straightforward. He castles. Byrne finally commits the knight to the e2 square, which is the less symmetrical option than going to f3, which would have been moving towards a potentially identical setup for both sides if black were to continue with knight to c6 and e6, so a very slight imbalance now present. Fischer plays knight to c6, Byrne castles, and now it's time for Fischer to decide how he's going to develop the bishop. You could go out this way, bishop to f5 is very playable, but he decides to go the other direction with b6. And of course he's not planning bishop to b7 when his bishop's activity would be hindered by his own pawn. No, he's going to a6, where he'll be cutting right through white's camp, eyeing that rook on f1, pinning this knight. Now, whether Byrne was inspired by Fischer's idea or whether he would have played his next move b3 anyway, we'll never know. But he seems to be saying, if it's good enough for you, it's good enough for me. Might as well embrace the symmetry after Fischer's bishop to a6 and play bishop to a3. Now at this point, I'd like to stop and share with you a quote taken from Bobby Fischer's book, My 60 Memorable Games, a great resource by the way when researching this game, which is going to let us get a glimpse into the mind of Fischer himself as we take a look at some of his own analysis. But the quote I want to share is from Kenneth Kirby, who was the South African chess champion around the time that this game was played. And what he says about this position is, and I quote, "After White's 11th move, I should adjudicate his position as slightly superior and at worst completely safe. To turn this into a mating position in 11 more moves is more witchcraft than chess. Quite honestly, I do not see the man who can stop Bobby at this time," unquote. So yeah, I mean, we're barely getting out of the opening here, and we're not really even going to get a middle game, not one that isn't completely lopsided anyway. So we have a couple more moves before we get to the position that I showed you at the beginning of this video. We have rook to e8 from Fischer, prudently getting off the diagonal of that bishop on a3, and Byrne should really do the same. The engine is giving rook to e1 with total equality. But Byrne makes a slight inaccuracy now that is virtually imperceptible. Well, imperceptible to anyone but Fischer anyway. Byrne plays queen to d2, setting the stage for the first of 3 incredibly brilliant and shocking moves that Fischer will play before the end of this game. And they are moves that no one will see coming or be able to grasp the significance of even after they appear on the board. And look at the symmetry here. The only noticeable difference between white and black's position is that Byrne has a knight on e2 as opposed to Fischer's knight on f6. So how the hell is Fischer going to create the necessary imbalances to give him a crushing attack in only 4 moves? Well, if you haven't seen this game before, feel free to pause the video and try to find the move that Fischer now plays to catch Robert Byrne completely off guard. Not to mention all of the spectators as well. No one saw this move coming, and the move is, in 3, 2, 1, e5, which very subtly takes advantage of the fact that the knight on e2 is still pinned to the rook, and you'll see why in a bit. But first, let's talk about the weakening of Fischer's d-pawn as a consequence of this move. After d takes e5, which is best, and knight takes e5 by Fischer, at which point he has this isolated pawn, which is being hit by 3 of white's pieces, only defended by 2. White cannot win the pawn at the moment due to the vulnerability of the knight on e2, but even if he could, you wouldn't want to grab on d5 anyway. What you'd want to do is play knight to f4 to try to keep this knight out of d3. That's more important, as you'll soon see. But let's hear what Fischer had to say about this position in his subsequent analysis. He says, and I quote, "I was a bit worried about weakening my queen pawn, but I felt that the tremendous activity obtained by my minor pieces would permit white no time to exploit it." Unquote. So Fischer is thinking dynamically, looking at the position in a much more advanced way than even Byrne, who later said that he was amazed at this advance and thought that it left the d-pawn hopelessly weak. So we see that already at age 20, Fischer was on a whole nother plane of chess thought, even than an elite player like Byrne, who in this position now has to decide how he's going to deal with some invasive moves that are on the cards, like knight to d3, knight to e4, when all black's pieces are suddenly getting alarmingly active. So he correctly decides it's a good idea to move a rook. So he's got that much right, and he even knows the right square for the rook, which is d1. But unfortunately for him, though happily for the rest of the world, because otherwise we probably wouldn't have this beautiful game, he chooses the wrong rook. So pause the video if you'd like and try to work out which rook should move to d1 and why. And here it comes, Robert Byrne's move in 3, 2, 1. He played rook f to d1, which looks reasonable. You're breaking the pin on the knight, but before we look at what's wrong with this move, which will become very clear very soon, let's take a look at the correct move, rook a to d1, which more or less maintains equality. Black might be slightly better, but this move really bothered Fischer after the game when he was analyzing, since the more he looked at it, the more he said he thought it favored white, and he didn't like the fact that his amazing game that he just played might have a flaw, even if his opponent didn't exploit it. So Fischer's getting so good at this point that he's playing hypothetical games against himself. But during the game, he had calculated a crazy variation starting with knight to e4, which I'm not going to get into, but suffice to say, he originally thought it would be winning for black, but it was discovered later that it definitely was not winning. So he said he spent a whole evening just staring at this position, trying to come up with a move for black to justify this weak d-pawn. And the move he eventually found, which is a top engine move, is queen to c8. Just getting off the d-file, letting the d-pawn go, but targeting h3. So if knight takes d5, we'll have knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, rook to d8, pinning the bishop to the queen, meaning there's a threat of the knight coming into f3. So best is f4, adding some coverage to that f3 square with the rook. And next comes an exchange sack with rook takes d5, queen takes d5, bishop to b7, cutting right through those light squared holes on the king side. So we have queen to d2, and all of these moves given by Fischer so far 100% agree with Stockfish, by the way. Pretty remarkable. Here he finally diverges from what the engine says is best, giving queen to h3, very natural looking, but queen to c6 is a bit more accurate, slightly favoring black, but the position is roughly equal. And Fischer's analysis just keeps going, but I want to get back to the game, to this position where Byrne made his first significant error with rook f to d1, and you might be thinking, how is this worse than rook a to d1? I mean, you're unpinning the knight, that's got to be good. Well, that is true, and that is good, but there is something this move does that is not so good, something that Fischer is about to exploit, and he begins with knight to d3. Okay, not ideal. You don't typically want to tolerate an enemy knight hanging out on a square like that for too long, but does black have any immediate threats? Well, Fischer gave knight to e4 as the biggest potential problem, which would hit the queen and the pawn on f2 with 2 pieces, and the engine agrees that is a threat, but it says that knight to g4 would be even stronger, after which if you try to defend f2 with rook to f1, black could actually sack both of the knights for the rook and the pawn. And then there's going to be tactics involving these bishops, like bishop takes e2. You can pause the video and explore that variation if you want. But Fischer's move, knight to e4, is a winning threat and would be very forcing. So if he were allowed to get his knight there, then taking the knight would pretty much be forced, which would just solidify this knight's position on d3. And the future is not looking too bright for white. But it is white's turn to move here. And I should mention this move f3 that Fischer talked about. It would stop both knight to e4 and knight to g4, but it would also weaken e3. So after bishop to e3 targeting that pawn, you'd be forced to play f4, blocking that, so you haven't really solved anything. But in the game, Byrne comes up with what he thinks is a simple solution to these issues with the move he plays next, queen to c2. Just threatening to take the knight on d3, grabbing 2 minor pieces for a rook. So black has no time for knight to e4 here or knight to g4, but queen to c2, played here on move 15, is nevertheless a blunder, sealing the fate of Robert Byrne. Better would have been knight to f4, challenging the knight on d3 that way, adding some lateral defense to f2. Black could then respond with knight to e4, hitting the queen, which would still be on d2, with a significant advantage. But this would have been nowhere near as nasty as what Fischer is about to play next, a move which comes as a bolt from the blue, as they say, and it's this game's shocking move number 2 that no one saw coming. Pause the video if you want to try to spot it, but here it is in 3, 2, 1. Knight takes f2, an unbelievable sacrifice, which Fischer calls the key to black's previous play, and he says that the complete justification for this sack does not become apparent until white resigns. So we finally get to see why rook f to d1 was the wrong move. This knight sack wouldn't be working if the rook was still here to recapture. It also wouldn't work if knight to f4 had been played, like the engine had suggested, when the queen could capture. But here, you only have the king. And so, Robert Byrne says, "Prove it to me, young man," and plays king takes f2. A move which allows Fischer to now get his knight into g4 with check, hitting e3. King g1 is the only reasonable response. You don't want your king moving towards the center, and king to f1 would run into a triple fork of the queen, the king, and the rook, instead of just a fork of the queen and rook after knight takes e3, played by Fischer. The queen, of course, gets out of the way. And what would you play here as black? And the fact that I'm even asking the question is probably enough to tell you that it's not going to be the obvious knight takes d1, which the engine says would equalize. Black would be slightly up in the material count, but with that weak d-pawn, nobody's winning with correct play from both sides. But this is not the conclusion that Byrne came to, as he looked at this position, fully expecting knight takes d1. He later said that as he sat pondering why Fischer would choose such a line, because in his mind it was so obviously lost for black, Fischer suddenly played knight takes g2. The third and final, totally unexpected tactical blow that was beyond anyone's ability to wrap their head around except for Bobby Fischer. Byrne later wrote, quote, "This dazzling move came as a shocker. The culminating combination is of such depth that even at the very moment at which I resigned, both grandmasters who were commenting on the play for the spectators in a separate room believed I had a won game," unquote. So what's up with this move? Why would Fischer choose a bishop over a rook? Well, it doesn't take too long for the truth to be revealed. After king takes g2, here comes d4, opening this deadly long diagonal towards Byrne's king. Knight takes d4 is played, there's really nothing better, and after bishop to b7 check, the white king is a little short on safe squares. That is to say, he has 0 safe squares. The move played in the game is king to f1, but let's take a look at king to g1. This would have gone down in flames to bishop takes d4 check. And after queen takes d4, if you've been playing your puzzle rush, you can probably find black's next move. In 3, 2, 1. Rook to e1 check. Can't take the rook or you're losing the queen. And if you move your king to f2, we have queen takes d4 check, rook takes d4, rook takes a1, and black is going to win with the extra material. So played in the game was this king to f1, which at first glance looks like white just might be okay. And that's not just the non-grandmaster in me talking. Apparently the two grandmasters providing commentary to the spectators were still telling everyone that Fischer had lost, even after he made his next move, which was so devastating that it caused Robert Byrne to resign. So if you want to try to play like Fischer one more time, pause the video, try to spot Fischer's next move. Here it is in 3, 2, 1. Queen to d7? Looks a little anticlimactic, but it's actually quite insidious, heading for h3 with check. A threat which is so impossible to deal with that Robert Byrne refused to make any more moves, also known as resigning, much to the shock of all the spectators who still thought he was winning. And this also came as a bitter disappointment to Fischer, as he would later write, since he was not allowed to actually play the brilliant finish that he had calculated. So what were Byrne and Fischer both seeing here? Well, the threat is queen to h3 check, of course, followed by the bishop capture on d4, which would draw the white queen away from the defense of g2, where there would be mate. So what can white do? Well, let's start by taking a look at queen to f2. Now the knight's defended by a rook, meaning the white queen can hang back and defend g2. We still get queen to h3 with check, and after king to g1, black now has a gorgeous move, which I don't blame Fischer at all for being sad that he couldn't play. Try to spot it if you want, but here it comes in 3, 2, 1, rook to e1 check. Amazing. What can you do? The queen can't take, or you're getting mated, and if the rook takes with rook takes e1, guess who's only defended by the queen now? The knight is captured, and if you want to avoid immediate mate, you gotta sack more than just the queen, who is not defending g2 anymore, being pinned to the king. So the engine's giving rook to e4. You gotta block this diagonal at all costs, but you're only delaying mate, not preventing it. The queen falls with bishop takes f2 check, and the rook will be captured shortly. Okay, any other possible defenses? Well, there's one more I should probably show you. This move knight c to b5, defending the knight that way. But again, we have queen to h3 check, king to g1, and here, bishop to h6, hitting the queen, who has to defend against mate on g2. So basically, she's just functioning like a rook right now. And so you have the choice of going to f2 and then losing the queen to bishop to e3, or you can move somewhere like b2, and after bishop to e3 check, you can only put your queen in the way and then get mated with queen to g2 checkmate. So some absolutely astounding play from Bobby Fischer. This is why he's a legend, and this game belongs to that special category of games that were played long before strong chess engines were even a blip on humanity's radar, yet are nevertheless indistinguishable from a game where a strong engine destroys a top human player. because at no point in this game did Bobby Fischer significantly deviate from what Stockfish said black should do. There were only a couple times where the engine was flip-flopping between Fischer's move and a different move at different search depths, but this was basically a flawless performance by Fischer. And it kind of reminds me of Magnus Carlsen on his best day. So what do you guys think? Can you show me a Magnus game or any game that you think is superior to this? If you do, I might just review it. But for now, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.